Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to have you along for this Finance Watch dialogue on the digitalization of money today. My name is Emily Glantz. I'm a research advocacy and strategy officer with Finance Watch. For those who aren't familiar with us, we are an EU-wide network of civil society actors dedicated to making sure that finance serves society and not the other way around. We have 110 members in our organization, so that includes actual organizations as well as individuals who are separate from an organization. The team comes primarily from the financial industry, so we have our work cut out for us. Our vision for the financial system is a financial system that is stable, inclusive, and purpose-driven, meaning that it serves the needs of society and the climate. We have our work cut out for us, and what I mean when I say that is, if you look at the amount of money that's being spent in the Brussels lobbying industry, the financial industry spends about 30 times as much as all civil society organizations, trade unions, and consumer organizations combined. So we're really punching above our weight and have a pretty grand vision. I'll just give a quick spiel on what Finance Watch works on, and then we'll move on to the discussion with Brett. So what we're working on is quite a broad array of issues. We're looking at fiscal policy, so making sure that economic and monetary policy enables the transition to a just and sustainable society. We're also working on sustainable finance, so making sure that we're combating greenwashing and obligating financial and non-financial institutions to shift towards a transition to a sustainable economy. And then maybe more relevant to today's discussion, we work a lot on issues in retail and financial inclusion. So we're working to prevent and relieve over-indebtedness, but we're also working to make sure that people have access to safe, fair, affordable retail and financial service and financial products. So that include this basic package, as we call access to cash, bank accounts, savings, insurances, and pensions. And then in a lot of EU member states and around the world, it is necessary for people to have access to different forms of credit. Last but not least, we're also focused a lot on digital finance issues, which relates really nicely to today's discussion. And what we're doing with digital issues is making sure that there's an adequate amount of regulation for emerging markets and new forms of finance, and raising awareness around issues related to the digitalization of finance, which is what brings us here today. So we have with us to guide the discussion, he's a man who wears many hats, an author, journalist, former derivatives broker, and I've also heard him called a monetary anthropologist. So Brett Scott is here today, and he will be, walking with me through this discussion on the digitalization of money and how it might affect us, who's behind it, and lots of other fun tidbits. So maybe Brett, we want to kick things off. Can you tell us a bit about your background, maybe your work as a broker, the subsequent work that you've done with civil society organizations or nonprofit organizations?
Sure. I have a background in anthropology and history actually as well, and international development. So there's like a few sort of academic backgrounds I have, but economic anthropology being sort of one of the things that most drives me or I'm most interested in. But I went and worked in the financial sector, actually partially out of a kind of adventurous economic anthropological impulse. And that was back during the financial crisis. So I actually worked as a derivatives broker, OTC swaps broker, for anybody who knows about that world. But that's very kind of like high finance, right? So it's very your sort of top layers of the financial sector, most abstract layers in many ways. And so I did that for a couple of years, but then I was always coming from quite a politically radical background. So there's quite an interesting combination to have that mixed with the sort of high finance stuff. So what I started doing after that experience, well, I started working with many different civil society groups on finance campaigns, from everything from like commodity speculation campaigns through to divestment, through to, all sorts of stuff, banking. And also wrote a book about that called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money, which came out in 2013. But that took me around, collaborating with many different groups on just general financial reform, financial activism, but also alternative finance. So looking at, how do you build alternative banking, alternative currencies, alternative everything. And I guess those sort of eventually led me, interestingly, around sort of, 2012, 2013, lots of people in tech like to perceive themselves as being involved in alternative finance. So I started getting lots of invites into the tech world because lots of these fintech companies had this sort of self-image of being a kind of alternative economy almost, which nowadays seems very naive and sort of idealistic. It was clearly fintech has been absorbed into the standard financial sector. But back in sort of early fintech rhetoric had a lot of this idea that it was kind of revolutionizing finance and so on. So yeah, I see that's partly what drew me into this world of looking at the intersection of big tech and big finance, which is partly what the book is about. Yeah, that's the sort of very broad brush look at my.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like you've had a lot of interesting experiences, and you do get to read about them in the book. For those who are curious, so Cloudmoney, it's cash, cards, crypto, and the war for our wallets is Brett Scott's new book that has just come out. And I did read it, and there's a lot of, it almost reads a little bit like a Hunter S. Thompson book. It's a bit punchy and exciting, and it kind of feels like you're taking instead of a boring read through, something very heavy on economics or financial systems. It's kind of punchy and has some insider anecdotes, and really.
I like that. I always make sure whenever I'm writing about economic systems that I use no numbers or graphs. I really think it alienates people very deeply when you try to present financial systems in terms of numbers and graphs, because actually they're highly political systems, they're human systems. And I think too much economic writing fixates upon the sort of numerical aspect of finance, which I think is misleading in many ways and doesn't really get you. So I tend to focus a lot on the kind of lived experience, the sort of actual political dynamics and so on.
Yeah, totally. I think that really shines through your background as an anthropologist and looking at, money in a way that we're maybe not so used to, looking at like how it has developed as a society and psychologically more than anything. Maybe you could tell us a few words about what inspired you to write this book specifically.
Yeah, sure. It's a couple of things. I mean, as mentioned, I sort of naturally was transitioning to looking at the intersections between, the financial sector and the technology sector. Because, I mean, if you're looking at, how the global economy has changed in the last, let's say 10 years, one of the big things you've seen is, it used to be finance and oil companies were the ones that had the biggest market capitalizations and stock markets. And now it's all big tech companies who've taken over in terms of being the highest valued companies in the world. So there's clearly been a massive rise in power in the world of big tech. And so I just was naturally being drawn into that world because I'm often sort of seeking out these type of looking at who's the power, where power in economic systems lies. And so a large part of my interest in the book was about the intersection of big finance and big tech. But interestingly, it intersects with all my work on money, which I've been doing work on, monetary systems for quite a while, and my work on cashless society, because one of the core arguments in the book I'm sort of making is that this intersection between big finance and big tech is essentially crushing the cash system. All right, there's a kind of like the cash system kind of like stands in the way of this intersection. This merging. But more specifically, on one of the reasons why I was, inspired to write about cashless society stuff is that in the public debate about cashless society, I was getting very, very frustrated about the way it was presented. And not only on the technical level, often people, if you would see these articles about cashless society, there would be technical errors that people would be talking about cash as if it was just sort of like a old school version of digital money, whereas I would be seeing them as entirely different forms of money issued by entirely different players. And so I was trying to sort of look at the technical aspect of it, but also the sort of ideological aspect of it, because the way that cashless society is typically presented in the media at least in your sort of, traditional innovation press and so on, is as this kind of bottom-up phenomenon. So you'll have headlines, for example, that say things like consumers increasingly turn towards digital payment. And it's this kind of like, the way that it's painted is as if like all the agency lies in us, the sort of average person on the street. That's where the agency lies in an economy. Right? And we are the ones that drive things and bring them into being, which is a very, very standard ideology in corporate capitalism. The idea that everything in the economy is driven by the ordinary individual rather than the big players. So in a way, one of my big agendas was to rewrite that story, or at least to rebalance it, to say, actually, we might experience ourselves at some loose level as choosing these things, but really you got to look at how the sort of choice architecture is molded and engineered by large players often, the menu setters, as it were. And so this is a large part of what I've been doing.
Totally. Yeah, I think there's an interesting perspective you take that kind of contradicts the traditional story around supply and demand. And I personally related to it a lot, because you are always hearing these like, oh, the future is here, the future is digital. Everybody's kind of on board. We're transitioning and millennials want it. And I'm like, oh, really? Do I? And Gen Z, we want it. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I know in my research around cash and preferences, there, of course, there's a tendency for older groups to kind of indicate that they have a higher preference for cash. But I don't think, even where I'm coming from in Sweden, which is kind of in the EU anyways, a front runner in the transition to this cashless society that we allegedly are all wanting. It's not just older people who find the value in having cash and keeping it around. Younger people are also kind of speaking out and saying, yeah, this is nice and convenient to be able to use, digital means to make payments, but cash shouldn't go away. Sure, I think that's an important message to kind of keep out there, that it's not just, consumers demanding it. It almost feels like maybe it's being pushed on us a little bit.
Yeah, and actually I'm drawing on quite a old and in some circles controversial tradition, which, in typical economics, what somebody says on a survey is taken as some kind of like self-apparent truth. So you go around and you say to a bunch of people, do you prefer this or this or this? Yeah. And the person says, oh, I prefer this or something. And that's sort of like taken uncritically, as if that's sort of just an indicator of preferences. Right. So there's this idea that your individual preference reflects like your inner desire, rather than some structural situation you find yourself in, which pushes you in that direction. Or, for example, some ideological force field you find yourself in. So, for example, within the kind of like tradition of like Gramsci, you're looking at things like hegemony, you've got cultural hegemony, the way that whole ideas kind of like sort of the interests of very large corporations, how they can get absorbed into a population as common sense. Right. So if you go around the streets and you just ask people, do you think a cashless society is inevitable? Many people actually believe it's inevitable, but they will still be using cash, but they can't quite tell you why they think it's inevitable. There's just some sort of this generalized sense that it is. And if you start to zoom out, you say, well, where does that story come from? Where does that sort of inner sense of this inevitability emerge from? All right. And this is the kind of stuff that you're looking at in sort of like, and this is quite hard stuff to pitch at a sort of policy level, because in typical policy speak, you just sort of say, well, consumers want this, they want that, they don't like this and that. So it's sort of quite like, it's quite interesting trying to sort of make these arguments to people to say, how is it that these preferences are formed? How are you influenced by large hegemonic players? What situations do you find yourself in that makes it ever more likely that you'll make these choices, and so on like that?
Sure. And it comes down a lot to just the shops you might be in, or geographically where you're located, that kind of pushes you to make certain choices. And for example, where I'm at, it's really not common to be able to go to a store anymore and pay with cash. they just don't keep the resources on hand to be able
and
to
imagine,
do that.
imagine that situation now gets reported on by a journalist as consumers opt for digital payments. It's like, yeah, well, precisely, because you're forced to. Right. So it's this kind of like, you can sort of see how these power structures get written in language often. You don't find headlines that say people increasingly pushed towards digital payment. You always find it they opt for it, right? So there's all this kind of like subtle politics going on. And a lot of my work on this, what I call the war on cash, which sometimes has a sort of conspiratorial sound to it. It's been about essentially the top-down push against the cash system, which has happened for a very long time from many different players, and how it's essentially slowly working and taking off in many places. You're in Sweden where that's taken off quite a while ago, but for example, in London, it's only taken off in the last couple of years. Literally, that switch happened probably in the last 2 years in London. And now suddenly the whole psychological balance has been altered, and basically everyone's recalibrating right now in London. So you'll see people starting to feel embarrassed to use cash. You'll see them starting to feel like they're out of sync with the rest of the environment around them. And, so in London, it's no longer becoming a choice. You're basically being forced into that system now. But in the early phases of these pushes against cash, it's the sort of slow erosion of the system that happens.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess maybe it might be important to talk about, because not everybody's really aware. I mean, in some senses, the transition to digital money might seem like it's really convenient and useful, but maybe it might be nice to talk a little bit about like, what are the risks if we're not able to pay in cash anymore?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I suppose we've probably jumped ahead a bit, but one of the big arguments I'm sort of making here is traditionally the cash system, the way it's presented in the sort of standard innovation press and by digital payments promoters, as this kind of old sort of redundant form, and this idea that digital money is an upgrade. It's an upgraded form.
Sure.
All right. Whereas what I'm arguing is that it's technically totally untrue. All right. Actually, the entire digital money system is predicated upon access to government money, or in the case of the EU, sort of a meta government money. But the only form of that you can actually directly hold is cash. All right. So the entire digital payment system is a system of promises for government money that you can pass around. And the big metaphor that I use in the book for this is I use a sort of casino metaphor, where I ask a person to imagine themselves going into a casino with a bundle of cash. Let's say it's 100 euros. You go into a casino and they hand you 100 euros worth of chips. Right. So these chips in a casino are a privately issued form of money, a secondary form of money, which can be used within a constrained environment. All right. And in that casino, there are now essentially two different forms of money. There's going to be the cash, which is owned by the casino now, and chips, which are owned by you. All right. And the digital money systems that we use are very, very similar in a sense. What we call very sort of misleadingly bank deposits are essentially commercial bank chips that they issue out to you. All right. So the entire digital money system is based on these bank-issued digital chips. Of course, it's more complex than that because the banking sector has the ability to issue far more of these digital chips than they actually have in state money, which is sometimes referred to as fractional reserve banking or credit creation of money. But nevertheless, the basic idea is when you're moving towards a so-called cashless society, what you're moving towards is a society where you're having to use these commercial bank chips for all your transactions. Which immediately you can see transfers a whole bunch of power away from the public sector towards the banks. And we already have the monetary system largely controlled by the banking sector, but this represents an even further transfer of power into the realm of the banking sector. So if you're interested in simply at the level of balancing power in economies, you're thinking about how do you maintain the public money system and protect it from this full privatization process. And of course, once you're in that fully privatized system, then all these issues of surveillance come out because digital systems can be surveilled. There's issues around censorship, how payments can be controlled. There's issues around resilience. how those systems can easily collapse and fall apart and don't withstand all sorts of things. But also exclusion. This is one of the sort of big things that's often discussed, is how many people are actually excluded from those systems. I mean, right now in London, where essentially the privately issued digital money issued by the banking sector is now basically taken over almost entirely, or is in the process of it. You're starting to see the formation of this kind of dual economy, where if you're a person who basically doesn't want to use that or can't use that, you're basically forced out of whole sections of the economy. You can't enter loads of different shops. You're basically forced into a sort of separate part of the economy. And this is a very, very big problem. So there's many issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for example, you talked a little bit now about, resilience of the system as a whole. And I think that's something that some people were really aware of and talking about early on. And more people are starting to realize, thanks to people like you who are talking out about this and raising awareness around the issues involved. For example, I know, again, to give an example of Sweden, really the front runner here, the transition to, touchless payments and cash-free society, the Swedish government actually came out in 2019, I think it was, and said, whoa, maybe we need to wait a minute and back up, because what if the digital systems do collapse? What happens then? So now they've actually come out, I think it was just about a month ago, the government released a statement saying all households should keep at least the equivalent of 200 euros cash in their home as part of a resilience program. So it's just really interesting to see.
Well, actually, the Swedish government did this like quite a while back, actually, saying, in case there's a war with Russia, you should consider keeping some cash, because obviously these digital payment systems are going to be a new frontier of cyber warfare. If your entire economy is based on access to keeping a particular IT networks up, it becomes an obvious attack point for cyber attacks, and but also, of course, things like electricity failures and so on. I mean, in the US, this is or anywhere that has natural disasters, this is actually a big thing, because the Federal Reserve, for example, sees huge increases in the demand for cash prior to hurricane landings, which is very obvious, right? It's like cash is offline money. It doesn't crash. It's far more resilient. All right. So, and that's partially why when I'm developing metaphors, and one of the metaphors I've been using for cash, which is, metaphors can be dangerous sometimes because they convey some things and not others. But one of them is cash is like the public bicycle system of payments. You might not want to use a bicycle to try and ride, 300 kilometers, but it becomes very, very useful in situations when you're having like mass traffic congestion, pollution, like we have car crashes and so on, right? So the whole sort of narrative around cash being the horse cart is a very, very particular lens designed to demonize it. But actually, cash in many ways is a more advanced form of money in many situations. And this whole sort of fetish that we have in society for this idea that anything that's more complex, more large scale, and faster is somehow always better is really a kind of corporate ideology. It's not really a true human belief.
Sure. Yeah. And what do you do when the car breaks down? You might have to take the bike. So it's interesting. I think we've touched a little bit on cash, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about some of the messages in the book and where you see like fintech coming into all of this.
Sure. I mean, look, one of the arguments I'm making is, if you're analyzing the sort of typical economics lens, which is like, what do consumers say and so on. It's very much this idea that there's this sort of, everything in the economy is driven by the average person. And you can kind of imagine an economy as a sort of huge interdependent mass, right, of all these people locked together. And the imagination is that somehow all the little players in that are making individual choices, which is changing the overall structure. All right. Whereas in the kind of tradition I'm coming from, it's often, you zoom out and say, okay, what are all the big players doing in this mesh? And if they all go in the same direction, they're pulling people along, right? And so if you zoom out and you look at the global economy from a kind of sort of meta capitalist perspective, you can see it's like, well, what is the profit in terms of like what large corporates want to do? They want to scale, they want to spread across the world, they want to increase the speed of their transactions. right? And they want to fuse together often to form these huge oligopolies. I mean, to do that, you need digital money to be your primary way of doing everything, right? You can't do globe-spanning transactions with cash. It's inherently localized. It's inherently face-to-face. It's inherently human in a sense, right? Whereas if you want these like vast globe-spanning systems, you have to have these digital money systems. Amazon cannot operate without huge fintech architectures, right? That basically enable it to do that. So if you're looking at the sort of what the fintech sector essentially does, a large part of what, you know, traditionally was described itself was as revolutionizing or democratizing finance. But I simply see it as it's automating finance, right? It takes the standard financial system and just speeds it up and automates it, right? Which is something that's been happening in capitalist systems for a very, very long time. It's just that, you know, when you have an incumbent industry that has an existing business model, so the old banking sector, any newcomers will always present themselves as being revolutionaries. But what they're essentially doing is often iterating upon exactly the same thing and finding some way to expand it. And that's really what the fintech sector has been doing. Finding ways to expand the logic of finance into places which were previously resistant from it or were previously not profitable enough for the financial sector to kind of creep into. All right. So a lot of the fintech sector does that. And that's very, very important for big tech, because if you want to be able to target markets all around the world, you have to have everybody integrated into those infrastructures. All right. The cash system and any kind of offline economies are essentially resistant to being incorporated into things like Amazon and so on. And so I'm looking at this kind of, you know, the fintech is essentially this bridging role between big finance and big tech. And, you know, one of the things to sort of mention is that, like, if you are in fact indeed caught in this economic system, which we all are, and you end up excluded from it by not having access to those architectures, you might indeed experience relief when you finally get access to it. You know, so sure. It's true, you might have a sort of self-belief that's like, oh, wow, I finally have access to the app, now I can operate. But it's this kind of like the way we describe it as this kind of like empowerment. It's like, well, really you're entering into a state of capture, all right? But you're kind of like dressing it up as being empowerment, which is a very unpopular thing to say in fintech circles or in financial inclusion circles for that matter, right? But really that's kind of what the situation we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I personally identify with that so much. As an immigrant to the EU, it actually took me quite a bit of time to be able to get a bank account here, and to be able, in Sweden, we have an instant payment service, an app that everybody uses. And it took me quite a bit of time to be able to, you know, be included in that. And I definitely did feel this kind of sense of relief once that did happen. But I think I want to talk a little bit more about this push you see from big tech and big finance. And I think it's maybe a little bit more than that, because it's not only big tech and big finance that are looking to kind of push towards this digitalization. It's also, you know, like all your favorite retailers, it's media providers, and they're kind of all wanting to, in some sense, commodify your data. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a whole layer of different, if you're talking about the sort of top-down pushes against the cash system, there's a whole bunch of different players, and some of them have more overt motives than others. I mean, in terms of the most overt people who attack the cash system, the payments companies, Visa and MasterCard, like literal overt, like propaganda against cash. And they've done this for a very long time. You know, Visa overtly attacks the cash system all the time, right? Because it basically, cash is its direct competitor, right? So, and they sort of try and paint this idea that, you know, having to use cash is some kind of injustice. And, you know, if you can get absorbed into their systems, you're going to be so much better off and so on. You know, this is Visa's standard line, right? And they sort of unashamed about this. I mean, in London, they ran the Cash Free and Proud campaign, when they were like, they literally said, we want to make cash feel peculiar by 2020. Like, they just openly state this.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah. And it's like, so those guys have very overt agendas, but the banking sector is slightly more like sort of subtle in the way it does it. Because of course, the banking sector runs the entire underlying account infrastructure that you'll be using when you transition away from cash. Okay, so and Visa works with those players. Visa's basic job is to coordinate movements of digital chips between bank accounts. Okay, so and then the fintech sector has, again, the sort of more kind of distant relation in the sense that you can't automate things that operate offline, right? You basically, you have a natural ideological alliance to digital payments because that's the realm that you operate in. Similarly with big tech, but in the world of big tech, it's not like they have a direct kind of, they don't see cash as a competitor. They just see it as a kind of like, it's a sort of an annoyance. It's a sort of parts of the economy that they can't access are characterized by cash usage. Okay, so for them, it's a slightly more kind of a distant thing. But in terms of your retailers, yeah, absolutely. This is a big, well, for a start, a large part of these retailers have been targeted by the payments companies. So, talks about, the war on cash. I mean, Visa very, very overtly has tried to sort of incentivize small bougie businesses in top cities to quote unquote go cashless.
Sure.
All right. Because it can really like restructure the cultural landscape if you get the sort of high status places to change their payments. But in terms of the big players, yeah, I mean, think about corporate capitalism more generally. Big players prefer to work with big players. All right. Uber doesn't want to deal with millions of people trying to hand the drivers cash. It wants to work with the data centers of other large players. All right, it's like a standard thing about all kind of these big players, and same with all big retailers and so on. So at some level, they reluctantly use cash because they realize that many people, many ordinary small scale players use this, but they, at some deep level, they hate this. All right. At one point, I'll finish this answer now. Sorry, it's very long. But at one point in capitalism, cash was the leading edge. It would have been the thing used to expand systems. But in the current phase, it's slowing everything down. It stops expansion. So ideologically, all the stuff has turned against it, right? It's now seen as like, oh, you still use that weird old form, but it's so slow and stuff, right? So that's, yeah.
Yeah, but it can be incredibly useful. I think that brings us nicely, and I see we have a question in the chat also. It brings us quite nicely into the discussion about crypto, because that's another one of the main focuses in your book. Do you want to maybe give us a little bit of a perspective on how you see crypto coming into the scene? Is it a disruptor, or is it just kind of, coming into the fold?
Sure, yeah. I mean, look, I was involved in the sort of Bitcoin community from about 2011, 2012. I got involved in that. And so I did spend quite a long time experimenting with in the early Bitcoin community. And I very quickly became quite critical about that. I can tell you why. But maybe the first thing I would say is, if you're looking at the development of Bitcoin in particular, it comes out of earlier developments from the sort of 90s and what was called the cypherpunks, and loosely termed these sort of digital activism groups, who actually were looking ahead in time and saying, if we do enter a cashless society, we're going to have all these problems about corporate and state censorship and surveillance and centralization of power, right? You can have everything going through these digital systems, which can be, become a vector via which to watch people and exert power. And so we got to be thinking about how to build the so-called digital cash, right? So a lot of the innovations that came together to form Bitcoin came out of this intuition, all right? And actually, when Bitcoin's basically a kind of synthesis of a variety of different innovations and kind of put together into this sort of recipe, as it were. And if you see the early Bitcoin white paper, it's referred to as a peer-to-peer form of electronic cash. And I guess when I was first looking at it, in a sense, the first hurdle of Bitcoin, which actually trips many people up in terms of understanding it, is it's very sort of technologically complicated. So it seems very sophisticated. And at a technological level, it is. It's very sophisticated and almost like, it's actually quite beautiful. It's at some level on a technological level, because it's so like everything's been synthesized in this very like elegant way, albeit now it churns through huge amounts of electricity due to that design, right? But at a monetary level, it's extremely crude, right? So many people have sort of like conflated the sophisticated technological architecture with this idea that somehow it must be a sophisticated form of money. But it's incredibly like blunt, actually. And
what do you mean by it being kind of crude?
Yeah, and this is, I mean, I'm always in these perennial, like a crypto Twitter is a very violent place to be. If you, I don't know if you guys ever experienced trying to make any public commentary about Bitcoin, because it's basically become a type of religion now.
Absolutely.
A sort of secular religion where people have, perhaps people who are stuck in the kind of meaningless vortex of corporate capitalism and don't know what to do, have sort of seen in Bitcoin some kind of salvation narrative. Right? You can sort of engage in this fantasy of like attacking the big bad finance sector while simultaneously trying to make dollar returns, right? So it's a very captivating kind of like thing. But if you ever try to make statements about it, you get swarmed by people, all right? And, you know, one of the things I often say is like, well, they're essentially, I mean, if you look at what Bitcoin actually is, it's just numbers that you write out after you exert energy, and you call them tokens, and you can move them around, all right? But if I was to put it into sort of a physical analogy or metaphor, I would say, you know, it's a little bit like, I'm trying to think of the best metaphor for this. If I took a big sheet of, let's say, crystal, right, and I punched a whole bunch of like little circular discs out of it, all right, and then I handed them out, and I was like, there's your monetary system, all right. So they're just these like digital objects with no real characteristic that you can move around in a very sophisticated way. And this is why you have to put this huge cultural effort to try and convince people that these blank objects are something, right? So there's a massive, massive marketing industry behind Bitcoin trying to convince you that these things are actually something, and they have to place monetary imagery around them and so on. And this is why there's a big speculative market. So they're essentially a type of collectible with monetary branding pasted over it, which you can then move around between people. And I think that's the best way to understand Bitcoin. And this is also the best way to understand what it can actually do, because it certainly doesn't compete with monetary systems. These things actually depend upon monetary pricing in order to work. But they actually kind of like parasite upon and mimic monetary systems, which is an authentically interesting feature of stuff like Bitcoin. All right, they kind of depend upon monetary pricing, but can kind of like double as a type of form of exchange. I talk about counter trade in the book, which is the technical mechanism by which this occurs. But I don't know if you want me to go down into the weeds of that.
Yeah, maybe not for today. I think we'll try to get you back for another conversation later on in the fall, so we can dive a little bit deeper. I think it might be interesting. So we kind of talked a little bit about some of the risks already in terms of, the resilience of the system that you might be concerned about in an increasingly digitalized financial system. We also talked a little bit about individual privacy. Are there any other like risks that you're bringing up or kind of issues that you wanted to touch on with this book?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of, you know, libertarians and the easiest way sometimes to pitch the issue around cash is around the surveillance potential and the sort of censorship potential. So we're seeing the rise of increasing rise of authoritarianism in the world. And while many people kind of, you know, in democratic countries don't really think very much about this, if you speak to people who come from any kind of setting which has authoritarian tendencies, they very quickly understand the implications of being entirely dependent on digital systems. All right. And so that's one kind of big line of the book. But more generally, I'm just sort of making this, point about the increasing move, you know, even if you find things like digital payments convenient, that convenience is being paired with a huge amount of increased dependence upon concentrated corporate power. And asking people to think, you know, what do you think about that? Do you want to structure your economy like that? And shouldn't we be maintaining public alternatives? All right, so
sure.
That's a large part of what I'm arguing. But I guess maybe the last thing I'd say is that in some ways the book is also playing into a possible future movement about the return of the analog, right? Mm-hmm. So right now we're subject to an ideology that says, ever more concentration, ever more connection, ever more speed, scale is naturally better. All right. And I think many human beings, it's true that there's a short-term part of ourselves that likes some kind of slight increase in speed, but much of it is futile. For example, we're surrounded by time-saving technology, and yet we're busier than ever before. All right, precisely because under a capitalist system, technology is never used to save time. It's used to increase production. All right, so you end up ever more frenetic with technology. You don't somehow get more leisure. Actually, if you want leisure, you tend to have to retreat from technology. You tend to have to go to the countryside and turn off your phone. All right, so there's at some human level, we understand that there's something a bit like bullshit about this idea that somehow we get ever more convenience with technology. And I think there's going to be a future movement where people start to push back on that and move towards the analog. And I'm kind of trying to, I guess, talk about it in the realm of money right now and say, actually, I think it's naive to say, especially in the world of climate change, where we could very well be moving away from digital infrastructures that depend on huge, resource extraction.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think it's short-sighted to say we're all naturally moving towards this hyper digital future.
Sure. Yeah, I think personally you're doing a great job of just bringing awareness to the issue, and I want to make sure that there's time for some members of the audience here today to pose their own questions instead of me hogging the stage. But I just wanted to kind of round things up really nicely because it can cause a lot of hand wringing and a bit of, worry among people like, oh, okay, we're moving towards this digital society where there's this potential that, big tech and big finance have merged together and they're able to see all of my transactions. They know exactly who I am and where I am and the choices I make and that sort of thing. But I think what's hopeful in some sense, at least in the EU, and I'm hoping that the EU can kind of be a front runner in establishing and asserting people's rights to privacy. That's built into our founding articles, but it's also been operationalized or attempted to be operationalized in the General Data Protection Regulation. And now just this Tuesday, in terms of financial services legislation, there's secondary legislation, the Digital Markets Act, I believe, was passed or approved by Parliament anyways, essentially saying that these, big tech finance providers have to silo the information that they're using. So they're not able to look at all of it. And it could be, I think it's important as concerned citizens and members of civil society that we don't say, oh, okay, we've taken a step in the right direction. Our job is done. It's nice that we have people like you who are, keeping us aware and keeping us concerned about the potential risks involved and just maybe poking us to think a little bit more about what's going on, because it's not going to be a sprint of, okay, now our rights to privacy and the resilience of our financial systems are secured. It's going to be a marathon, and we need to kind of unite behind these ideas and work together to make sure that, there's kind of mimicking natural systems, there's resilience through diversity of options, of real choice of the way that we pay and exchange values with each other through money. And that we kind of take a little bit of a contrarian approach to that idea of constant growth. But maybe now is a nice time we can turn to the audience and ask a few questions. Maybe I see, do you want to say anything to this one in the chat? I see, why are politicians so keen to the digitalization of money? Is it lack of knowledge, consciousness, or influence of lobbies? Do you have any input on that one?
There's multiple different angles to that, I think. So on the one hand, there are actual state institutions that have particular agendas and undermining the cash system. States are complex entities. They're sort of, multifaceted entities. Unlike corporations are not that multifaceted. They got a pretty straightforward agenda. It's make more profit. Whereas states can be tied up with all these weird different agendas. Right. So actually, for example, in tax departments, there's lots of this idea. It's well, if you force everyone into the digital payment systems, then actually we have higher transparency and so on. Even though, of course, digital money systems are extensively used for tax avoidance and so on. So there is at least an idea that somehow we better to have everybody under digital systems than, but then, in central banks, that's not as central bankers are a bit more iffy about that. A lot of central bankers realize if you undermine the cash system, you have potential serious resilience problems in your monetary system. All right. So they're not on board with that all the time. All right. Albeit central bankers have been very weak on protecting the cash system so far, at least in many countries, because they don't want to upset the banking sector. That's my cynical take. Anyway, but in terms of your sort of general narrative that comes out of the mouths of politicians, well, often they're trying to sort of tag on to the sort of standard ideology of the times to sort of show that they're up to date. Like Rishi Sunak in the UK, sort of like, pointing at how he wants the UK to become this sort of like crypto hub for like stable coins and stuff. It's basically a kind of, I'm often analyzing, for example, in the UK, big finance and politicians are frequently just in a kind of embrace. And, Finance Watch knows this more than anybody. There's this huge kind of like amalgamation. And within these circles, there's a lot of this very uncritical sort of line that these players take, where they just sort of go along with the trends. And so that's at least part of it, is this sort of states feeling a kind of anxiety that they might not be, quote unquote, keeping up. All right. Interestingly, it's, the Bundesbank in Germany is one of the sort of ones that has often, in my experience at least, taken the strongest line on just being pro-cash. Right. They can't sort of overtly do it, but they tend to be just more like blunt about it. Like, it's like they have less anxiety about seeming to be uncool. Right. It's just a kind of almost like this more kind of confident stance, being like, we will protect this old system. Right.
That's refreshing to hear.
Huh?
I said that's refreshing to hear.
Yeah, I might be exaggerating it a bit, but there's angst in Germany about the kind of, we haven't caught up yet to the sort of digitization. But there's also kind of a sort of stronger sense of, that maybe it doesn't matter. All right. Whereas in the UK, for example, it's like, it's so highly captured by standard corporate ideology that politicians feel this angst if they're not sort of shown to be like keeping up with it.
Sure.
This is a very, sort of generic answer, but there's many different things going on in the States.
But if you're not going digital, essentially you're being left behind is the thing.
Yeah, and actually, again, in a transnational economy, you might indeed feel that pressure, especially if you don't feel in a strong position in that economy, in the global economy.
Sure. I think let's turn to the next one then. We had someone from the audience ask if you see any positive elements to the crypto world, if there's some social benefits that you might imagine there beyond the risks that you talked about.
Yeah, I mean, look, I only really spoke about Bitcoin, to be honest. So I didn't really go very much into the broader crypto world. I mean, obviously there's one of the positive elements, at least at some level, has been, it's brought a whole bunch of new young creativity into thinking about issues that have long histories of seeming very boring. All right. So there's been huge numbers of people who suddenly like getting excited about, revolutionizing, land registries or like all sorts of stuff that was previously considered like very dull. Often what ends up happening though is that you sort of reinvent the same institutions. So the crypto world's been going through these waves of naivety. It started out incredibly naive. And it's kind of gets more and more sort of like incorporated into standard institutions as it goes on. But yeah, I mean, look, there's interesting stuff. Like, I think the world of stablecoins is actually authentically interesting. I think it could actually create some quite like interesting disruption. Bear in mind that the banking sector that runs the standard digital money systems with your cards and stuff is sort of finding itself like under pressure in a sense from the potential future CBDCs, which would kind of undermine it. But also on the other side from these like stablecoin systems. And when I'm analyzing monetary systems, I often do it in these like concentric rings. I sort of see the sort of central banks in the middle and the banks around them and these third tier players like PayPal and stablecoins around that. And so there are these like forms of pressure that the banking sector is finding itself under. And I think the stablecoin system is one of those. Which is interesting. But, even in terms of Bitcoin, politically, Bitcoin's actually at a monetary level, it's extremely conservative. All right. If you're analyzing the monetary ideology of Bitcoin, it's essentially, it's like old school conservative. It's like hawkish. It's this very like hard money fixation upon like constraining the money supply, which is historically something associated with like creditors. Like wanting to sort of like hold the money supply tight, right? And actually, so at that ideological level, Bitcoin's actually way too conservative, right? But in terms of its actual reality of what it is, because it isn't actually a monetary system, it's a system of digital collectibles that can be used for exchange, which are pasted with this monetary ideology. But actually at that sort of level of its reality, it does actually have uses. If you actually are, for example, a refugee who's stuck in a particularly difficult situation with your unable to access a bank account or something, you actually can use these digital collectibles for exchange. All right. So it is possible, albeit they're highly volatile. So
Sure.
if you don't mind your nervous system being constantly rocked by the speculative markets, then fine. I personally wouldn't want to have my whole savings in something which is like gyrates by 40% at a time. But it does have a sort of marginal use in terms of it can be used for in these types of extreme situations. So I wouldn't deny that.
Sure. Yeah. It can do a lot more than just buy pizza, for example. How about central bank digital currencies? I don't want to say too much about this. I know that we're actively working on it, but it's not my specialty per se. But perhaps you want to talk a little bit about like central bank digital currencies, or even in the US now, I know that they're floating the idea of having like a digital dollar. Is this like a good public alternative to cryptocurrencies in your mind?
I wouldn't at all. I mean, I dislike the comparison between cryptocurrencies and CBDC. I see it's become this public narrative now. People are sort of like making out that the reason why CBDC has been touted is because of like stable coins, right? CBDC in my mind has been touted because of the sort of the undermining of the physical cash system. And then like crypto is sort of used as a sort of like public facing story. The main problem is that, your only form of state money you have access to is the cash system. So if you're trying to exit the banking sector, typically when a bank run, it's a bit like going to the casino and saying, I want you to take these chips and redeem them back for cash, please. And of course, with the banking sector, they issued far more of these chips than they have actually in cash. Sure. But the idea with the typical ATM was you're exiting the banking sector, you're redeeming its chips for state money or meta-state money in the EU. But if you suddenly have that system undermined, you have no access to state money, which actually underpins the legitimacy of digital money. So CBDC, in some ways, is people thinking about like, okay, if somehow the cash system's undermined, how will the public exit the banking sector? All right. Problem is, there's actually an interesting power balance between the state and the banking sector right now, precisely because cash is slow and physical. All right. So you can say, okay, cash is slow and physical, but it's the safest form in terms of its actual position in the monetary system. It's pure, central bank money. Whereas the digital fast stuff is privately issued money. All right. So you can choose between safe public money that's kind of slow and physical, or fast private money that's digital. But now if the state starts issuing its own form of fast public money, you have a real problem, because now your private sector actors are like, okay, this has a much stronger chance of competing with us directly. So one of the big angst that sort of underpins the CBDC debate is really, will the banking sector be undermined by the state or the central bank competing with it in a new kind of way through these digital systems, which is why the central bank digital currency debate is now being kind of diluted into this sort of debate about so-called like wholesale CBDCs and stuff, which is not that different to what existing reserves are. And so, I'm interested to see how that debate carries on, because again, it's one of the things that all politicians have to currently speak about. But behind the scenes, I'm pretty sure the banking sector is lobbying the hell out of that, because they are going to be very, very worried about if the public will be able to access like a true CBDC that will compete with them.
Sure.
So I imagine there'll be like limits placed on it, and you can only use a certain amount and so on. Like,
I've had the pleasure of being able to sit into some civil society meetings on the debate precisely on that, and it'll be interesting to follow and see how that develops. Maybe we could take a moment and just switch. I see another question in the chat, which I think is really interesting. So since you've worked a bit with civil society groups in your past, one of the audience members was wondering if you see some kind of opposition or some cracks in the dominant narrative that this development towards a cashless society is inevitable.
From civil society?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, in the UK, for example, the consumer rights group, which has been running a pro-cash campaign for some time now, and they're running it under a interesting line, which is about choice. And this is quite a strong line in a sense, within the sort of mainstream framing, to say we want more choice in payment systems, or to maintain choice. Because if you think about what a cashless society is, you're losing an option, all right? And I always hate the way that this term cashless is used to describe digital transactions, because it's entirely possible to have digital transactions coexist with cash, all right? But you kind of have this sort of strange language game going on in the public, which is people are imagining the end of an option rather than the coexistence of options. All right. So what Which is arguing for is to say, hey, we need to maintain payments choice. And in the US as well, there's a sort of Payments Choice Act that's being touted, which is also about protecting cash. And it's a little bit like protecting bicycle lanes in a city dominated by cars. You know, you're trying to protect diversity and resilience. So that's going on from civil society. I've also recently seen there's a couple of initiatives about promoting cash at small retailers. We're putting up these kind of like stickers saying, you know, cash welcome here and so on. So in terms of counteracting the sort of, you know, cashless places, which have put up those stickers saying, which send those, all those stickers, we shouldn't underestimate this in terms of cultural change and how attitudes are manufactured. When you're walking through the streets of London and you see all these stickers on doors saying, no cash here, you know, cards only, it's sending a massive cultural message. It's a kind of, you're kind of being trained as you walk down the street to view cash as something strange. So actually, in terms of a cultural offensive, you need a counterweight. You need people saying, we welcome this, we accept this. So that's quite an interesting little development I've seen. And more generally, and the last thing I'll say is I think what needs to happen is a large way that how the public debate's been framed mostly has been this idea that actually it is inevitable that we'll move towards this digital future, but we have to sort of slow it down to give people time to catch up. So a lot of the way it's been talked about in public is like, okay, all these elderly people, there's people who can't get access yet, wait for them, give them more time. And that's what the sort of like pro-cash, so-called pro-cash story is. Whereas I'm saying, you actually have to be way more aggressive than that. You got to say that cash is a superior form of payment in many situations, all right? And actually, it should be reinstated.
Absolutely, yeah. Access to cash and the cash infrastructure needs to be maintained. It's just, it seems pretty obvious to those of us working at Finance Watch. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I just want to put in the chat there for everybody. If you want to learn a little bit more about Finance Watch and the work we do, if you're not familiar already, you can sign up for our newsletter. And of course, please follow us on Twitter, follow Brett and see what comes out next. It'll be interesting to watch your journey. And I hope we can all work together towards maintaining a resilient and diverse payment system society. So thanks everybody. We'll make sure to post this recording online, so you'll feel free to share it with your friends later.
I'll just add that actually the book's coming out in 9 languages. So if if English isn't your first language, it'll be coming out in Italian, Spanish, Dutch, German, Russian, Chinese, Korean, many other languages, Portuguese. So over the course of the year.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's also available already in English on audiobook, which personally I enjoyed quite a bit. So check it out. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Brett. It was a pleasure having you here with us today.
Thanks so much.